It was a crisp Saturday morning when I decided to step outside for one of my regular walks. The kind of quiet, ordinary routine I had maintained for months as a way to clear my mind and get some fresh air after long work days that left me restless and fatigued. And though I had walked these same streets countless times, following the familiar route that looped around the neighborhood, I could never have anticipated that this simple act, one that many people take for granted, would escalate into an absurd confrontation with a woman whose sense of entitlement and impatience would ultimately lead her to call 911 simply because I had taken more than a few minutes to walk around the block twice, a perfectly legal, harmless, and reasonable activity in a suburban environment where residents routinely walked, jogged, and exercised their dogs along the sidewalks without incident. I left my house at around 10 in the morning, dressed in my casual jogging attire, with a small water bottle in hand and my earbuds ready for music, stepping onto the familiar pavement and taking in the quiet hum of the neighborhood, the smell of freshly cut grass wafting from the lawns, and the occasional chirping of birds that filled the air with a sense of tranquility that contrasted sharply with the often frantic pace of my work week. And as I moved along the sidewalks, I exchanged brief nods and greetings with neighbors who were outside tending to their yards or walking their dogs, all of us participating in the unspoken rhythm of suburban life where people acknowledge each other but do not intrude. The first lap around the block passed uneventfully, with no indication that anyone was paying particular attention to me, or that my presence could be construed as a source of concern, and I returned to the starting point with the thought that a second lap would be enjoyable, providing a bit more exercise and giving me a few extra minutes to enjoy the morning sunshine, the feeling of calm in my chest, and the simple pleasure of being outside, which had become increasingly important to me in recent months given the sedentary nature of my job and the stress I carried during the week. It was during the second lap, however, that I first became aware of her, the woman who would soon transform a perfectly ordinary activity into a dramatic public confrontation. She was standing in front of her house, arms crossed, her expression clearly one of irritation and disapproval, and though at first I assumed that her glare was merely the product of a bad mood or personal sensitivity, I soon realized that her reaction was directed at me specifically, and that she was actively monitoring my movements in a way that felt invasive and unnecessarily aggressive, the kind of attention that makes an ordinary stroll suddenly feel like a high-stakes negotiation in which one wrong step could provoke conflict. I attempted to ignore her, keeping my gaze forward and my pace steady, fully aware that there was nothing inappropriate about my actions. Yet I noticed her phone in her hand, an indicator that she was preparing to document or communicate about what she perceived as a problem, and by the time I completed my second full loop and returned near her property again, it was unmistakable that she had made a decision, because she stepped closer to the sidewalk and began speaking in a loud, deliberate tone, clearly intending to be overheard. And though I initially assumed she might be venting to a family member or neighbor, the volume, the urgency, and the content of her words quickly made it clear that she had dialed emergency services, describing me as a suspicious individual walking repeatedly in front of her house, and implying that my entirely lawful and ordinary activity constituted a threat to her safety. I froze for a moment, trying to process the situation, realizing with a mix of disbelief and frustration that a neighbor could interpret the act of walking around the block something that countless residents do daily without issue as justification for contacting law enforcement. And I paused in place, water bottle in hand, hoping that perhaps her actions might be de-escalated by my visible calm demeanor. But it was already delayed. She was fully engaged in the narrative she had constructed, gesturing toward me while explaining in an exaggerated fashion to the dispatcher that my behavior was suspicious, alarming, and potentially threatening, and I could see a few nearby neighbors peeking from behind their curtains or from across the street, exchanging looks that suggested they were trying to determine whether they should intervene, laugh quietly, or simply observe the unfolding absurdity. Within minutes, the distant sound of sirens reached my ears, signaling the arrival of law enforcement, and I continued to stand calmly at the corner, hands visible and empty, hoping to demonstrate my harmlessness and avoid any escalation. But she was undeterred, stepping fully onto her lawn and continuing to describe my presence in increasingly alarmist terms, pointing directly at me and insisting that my walking around the block twice constituted a clear and present danger, even as the sirens drew closer and the first patrol car turned onto the street, lights flashing, but not yet alarming anyone beyond signaling official presence. The officer arrived and approached the woman first, listening to her recount her version of events with dramatic gestures, elevated voice, and unmistakable indignation, as she clearly expected immediate action, as if my existence in the neighborhood had somehow violated her personal sense of order, while I remained calm, taking a few steps back to maintain distance and clarity. And when the officer finally turned toward me, he asked simple, direct questions: whether I lived in the area, whether I knew the woman, and whether I had any intentions beyond a casual walk around my own neighborhood. And I answered honestly, confirming that I lived only a few houses down, that I had been walking my regular route for exercise, and that my presence posed no threat whatsoever. The officer then listened to the woman's insistence that my walking was somehow criminal, her insistence growing more animated even as the evidence clearly contradicted her perception, with nearby neighbors watching silently, some clearly suppressing laughter, while others shook their heads in disbelief at the disproportionate nature of her complaint. And within moments, it became obvious that the officer's calm, methodical approach had rendered her argument ineffective, because the reality of the situation, an ordinary man walking twice around his own block, was plainly visible to anyone willing to observe without bias. After a few minutes of questioning and clarification, the officer turned to the woman and explained, in patient and firm terms, that walking on public sidewalks is entirely lawful, that taking multiple laps is permissible, and that calling emergency services over such a trivial concern was inappropriate, unnecessary, and a misuse of resources, emphasizing that 911 is reserved for genuine emergencies rather than personal discomfort or perceived annoyance caused by lawful neighborhood activity. And as he spoke, the woman's face shifted from indignation to a combination of embarrassment and disbelief that her version of events had been dismissed so quickly. I thanked the officer for his professionalism, confirmed that I intended to continue my walk if I wished, and he nodded, making it clear that no further action would be taken, and that the situation was resolved, while the woman remained on her lawn, arms crossed, lips pressed tight, clearly frustrated that the real world did not conform to her exaggerated narrative. And as I resumed my walk, slightly adjusting my route to avoid further direct interaction, I reflected on the surreal and absurd nature of what had just occurred. A mundane, healthy, and lawful activity, walking around the block twice, had triggered a 911 call, attracted law enforcement, and created a spectacle that involved not only the participants but several curious neighbors who had witnessed the escalation in real time. By the time I returned home, I felt a mixture of amusement, incredulity, and satisfaction, because while the woman had attempted to manufacture a crisis out of a completely ordinary situation, the outcome demonstrated that calm, rational behavior and clear communication could resolve even the most bizarre confrontations. And as I stepped through my front door, I realized that this incident would become a story I would recount for years as a testament to both human irrationality and the unexpected lessons in patience, composure, and perspective that everyday life can provide. And that sometimes even the simplest actions like taking a walk around the block can highlight the extremes of entitlement, overreaction, and the unpredictable nature of interactions with those who believe their discomfort justifies invoking authority.